My name is Adam Blackwell, the director of the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center. And normally I would be doing the introduction of our two great speakers. Unfortunately, I am having technical difficulties. So I'm going to have to ask my colleague, Sami Zdek, to do the needful. So Sami, over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Samim Sadek, research analyst at GTAC. Today, we have Andrew Watkins and Haroun Rahimi, and they will be giving a presentation titled The Taliban's Consolidating Evolving Rule in Afghanistan. Andrew is a senior expert with the U.S. Institute of Peace, has worked in and on Afghanistan in a number of roles. He served as an advisor to the UN Special Coordinator of Afghanistan. He worked in the country as a research analyst and policy advisor with the International Crisis Group, the United Nations, and other numerous organizations. Haroun is an associate professor and chair of the law department at the American University of Afghanistan. He's also a research fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. And without further ado, gentlemen.
Well, thanks very much, first of all, to Ambassador Blackwell. Thanks, Sammy, and to GTTAC for having us. Haroun and I have worked individually looking at the Taliban since their takeover and long beforehand during their insurgency throughout the first 20 years of this century. And we came together and published an article in January in the West Point's CTC Sentinel Journal along the lines of our topic to speak with you all today. I'm going to start us off and give us a very concise and brief overview of how the Taliban are situated in Afghanistan since their takeover. In a lot of ways, it surprised even experienced observers of Afghanistan. There were a lot of expectations that the group bucked, but there were many that they did not, and there were many expectations, some of them terrible predictions for the state of Afghanistan and the Afghan people that the Taliban did wind up following. It's fairly paradoxical. And then I'll hand it over to Haroun to dive into some more detail on a lot of what I cover. In brief, our findings were that the Taliban have consolidated their rule in Afghanistan more effectively than most observers anticipated that they would. The Taliban were inheriting a state that appeared to have totally collapsed when the former president Ashraf Ghani fled the country in mid-August 2021, while the U.S. and other international partner military forces were engaged in an evacuation from the country. As a consequence of the Taliban taking over through violent force, the United States, most of its allies, not quite the entire world, but most of the international community largely cut the Taliban off from the international banking, financial systems. The Afghan state, 20 years prior, had been existentially dependent on external sources of funding, both funding the state itself and all of the development, private sector activities, a number of economic bubbles that had come into being entirely rested on foreign intervention. Those are topics for another day, but they're an important foundation to the set of assumptions that most of us had, looking at the Taliban inheriting a state where not only the state, but the economy itself bottomed out quite literally days after they took over. Instead, we've seen the Taliban retain a great deal of the lower level administrative workforce of the state. They have, in some cases, certainly due to coercion, retained a great deal of the administrative state, its personnel, but also, very surprisingly, many of its structures. They have made increasing changes to the structures of the state along the way. But it's quite shocking how the Taliban's default was to leave in place a government, the structures of government, the superstructure of government that it had decried as corrupt and hollow for 20 years prior. Um, and the Taliban have also demonstrated there's nothing to call it other than confusing, a confusing mix of pragmatism in the way that it approaches everything from its external relations, its foreign affairs, with neighboring states, with regional powers, even with the United States, its sworn enemy for the majority of its existence, as the organization that we know as the Taliban. Um, and in many ways in domestic policy as well, but that pragmatism has been mixed with an at times shocking and bewildering sense of intransigence, and in ideological fervor. Again, that also applies everything from social policy, most notably, even those who have not been tracking affairs in Afghanistan closely since the Taliban's takeover will have surely taken note of their policies towards women, effectively eliminating women from most of the public sphere in Afghanistan, in a way that no other government on earth does, and in ways that human rights experts, many of them, label as gender apartheid. Um, the the Taliban's intransigence also applies to its foreign relations as well, and that can perhaps be seen most concerningly, not just for the region, but even as noted by senior U.S. officials, the head of the Pentagon CENTCOM, General Kurilla, and other top officials have testified to Congress that they are quite concerned by the activity of the TTP, or the Tehrik-e-Taliban, in Pakistan. Um, this is a Pakistani Taliban, which is a separate but closely affiliated organization that draws from tribal regions and border regions in Pakistan, that has long-standing ties with the Taliban and is understood to, since the Taliban's takeover, have been taking sanctuary in Afghanistan, a sanctuary that has enabled and propelled an unprecedented scale and scope of its campaign of violence back inside Pakistan. Um, this has destabilized relations, not only with Afghanistan's most historically problematic neighbor, but with the very state and government that many people assumed throughout the Taliban's insurgency and civil war were the Taliban's strongest patron. Um, Pakistan's support to the Taliban throughout the 20-year insurgency against US and NATO forces and their partner Afghan government, that's well documented. Again, a topic for another time. But the Taliban's willingness to support the TTP over the interests of maintaining a healthy and functional relationship with the neighboring state, Pakistan. Um, Again, it's a paradox when compared to so many of the other pragmatic decisions that the Taliban have made. What Haroun and I tried to do in our research, and what we'll try to unpack for you a little bit here today, is why those apparent paradoxes exist, and the logical path and some of the strategic calculus taking place within the Taliban's leadership that actually led to these, let's say, different categories of behavior. And one thing that we noticed very quickly on when we began thinking about the Taliban's behavior in terms of more pragmatic or more accommodating or more ideologically tinged, or more intransigent, whether it had to do with domestic or external policy, was that there seemed to be an interplay along both axes. both in terms of Taliban leadership figures that were more interested in the benefits that might result from pragmatic policymaking versus those more ideologically inclined to enforce rigid policies, and the dynamic that played out between those different groups of leadership, but also on the spectrum of policy making as the Taliban has tried to transition from an insurgent movement, very decentralized, very loosely controlled and commanded, to taking over the reins of, and in many ways dysfunctional, but also highly modernized administrative state. Um, how the Taliban has approached the spectrum of policy making and the interplay that we see in between their foreign relations and their domestic policy, and ultimately what they view as their sources of legitimacy. I think this will apply most germanely to GTTAC's audience and interests when it comes to this question of the TTP, of Pakistan, of the Taliban's willingness or interest to sponsor or to at least turn the other way when it comes to foreign fighters basing themselves in Afghan soil. The TTP is certainly not the only case, and there are many others we'd love to get to in Q&A later. But we'd like to open that up for discussion through the hour. Very briefly, I want to open up the leadership structure of the Taliban and the arc of its development since their takeover. For those who have studied the Taliban throughout their insurgency during the American and foreign military intervention, many will have probably noted the role and the office of the Emir, or the supreme leader of the movement. I think what is less clearly discussed at times is the arc of what the Emir's authority and role in practice and in everyday terms for the Taliban as a movement has actually meant, because it has changed quite a lot. From the founding Emir, Mullah Muhammad Omar, and his establishment of the Taliban, the takeover of the majority of the country in the 1990s, and their rule from 1996 to 2001, to the Taliban's apparent disintegration, but then reformation as an insurgency throughout the first years of the intervention, and then the Taliban's gradual strengthening cohesion, strengthening military organization over the 20 years of civil war, with American and foreign sponsorship to the Afghan government, the Islamic Republic. Excuse me. The Emir's role and its importance in governing the movement and its decision-making and how it carried out the insurgency especially changed quite a bit. Broadly speaking, we can say that in the second half of the insurgency, as the Taliban were attempting to reform, to reorganize, and to even develop hierarchies that had not existed even in the 1990s, to become more of a professionalized insurgent movement, we might say, you saw the Emir, who had not only gone into hiding, but it was later revealed in 2015, had in fact died several years earlier, and had handed over most of the day-to-day leadership of the movement to top deputies and lieutenants. What this effectively left the Taliban with for the second decade of its insurgency was an oligarchical leadership council decision-making structure. We could compare it, even though the Taliban, quite different in many ways, from a state apparatus, to the structure of a Politburo in a Soviet or early post-Soviet society. A delicate balancing act, a lot of behind closed doors deliberation, careful attention to not causing rifts or breakages within the movement, either along factional lines, different representatives of different movements, different regions, different geographies, different tribal interests behind closed doors within the leadership council, but also preventing rifts along policy lines. And that meant that the Taliban developed a very unique decision-making. Was more than a style. It really was a set of informal structures and standard procedures that worked very well for the movement's resiliency and survival throughout the insurgency, but did not uh, once they moved to take over the administrative structures of the state. What it appears that many of the Taliban's top echelons of leadership who had operated and governed the movement from that leadership council believed was that they would assume cabinet level posts, taking over ministries and certain governmental portfolios, much of them based in Kabul, where the emir, who had long since been relegated to a more symbolic or religiously focused leader, quite set apart from much of the day-to-day activity and decision-making of the movement, that arrangement would continue throughout the administrative development of the Taliban state. But by early 2022, 6 to 8 months after the Taliban had taken over, the outside world and even the Afghan population began to pick up signs that the emir was not going to go down as a ceremonial figure without a fight. That was perhaps most spectacularly revealed in March of 2022, when Taliban officials from a number of ministries had been assuring, again, the Afghan people and the outside world, that girls would be permitted to go back to secondary schools. One of the first things the Taliban had done in the weeks after their takeover was to put a temporary freeze on girls' secondary education, if not throughout all of the country, a majority of the country, which had, of course, had harrowing and terrible effects, not only on girls, but on the education system overall in Afghanistan, and still has to this day. Because in March 2022, in spite of Taliban reassurances, obvious preparations, and in much of the country, girls actually being readmitted back into schools that morning, by that afternoon, a last-minute order from the emir had come down that reversed the order that had come from a number of cabinet-level officials and their ministries. This was the beginning of an arc where we saw the emir attempt to reassert his power and authority, not just in a theological or ideological sense, but in the day-to-day minute details of governing the state. And what we saw was it proved more effective than most of the Taliban's top echelon of leadership, and perhaps even the emir and his supporters themselves realized. A catch-22 developed, in which if the emir did not willingly subject to a ceremonial role and step back and allow other Taliban leaders to run their portfolios relatively autonomously, his interference could not be countered by the Taliban without subjecting what they had always viewed as their their sources of legitimacy, their traditional sources of legitimacy, both within the movement and then it came to be as their existence as a state. Any attempts to challenge the emir's authority would reveal not only their ideology, but much of their rallying cry to their own supporters and their own members as being not much more than a house of cards. The Taliban top leadership over the course of 2022 and then into 2023, as much as we've been able to learn through sources on the ground, even through the occasional public expression of dissent and frustration from Taliban leadership, as much as the emir's direction taking over day-to-day control of the movement has upset many, even within this movement, and especially those more pragmatically minded, back to the two axes of our study. The Taliban's top leadership have not been willing and have in fact, put themselves to blocking any potential erosion of cohesion within their movement, within their hierarchies, within what they have claimed to be their sources of legitimacy, one pillar of which is the supremacy of the authority of the emir and his governance over the Taliban's affairs and now the Afghan state and society. This has produced political dynamics that make the Taliban state both relatively predictable in the near to medium term. Their prioritization of organizational cohesion is remarkably consistent over the past 2.5, now approaching in several months, 3 years of being back in power, and it continues the same patterns, prioritizing cohesion, even at the risk of policy disarray that we saw in their last years as an insurgent movement, especially when it came to key activities such as negotiating directly with American diplomats. The consistency of the Taliban's prioritization of this cohesion suggests that without radical changes, either through exogenous shocks or domestic pressures, none of which appear to be at a threshold level in today's status quo, the Taliban are likely to persist in that prioritization, which means that there will be deference. Not that the emir has full say, but that an equilibrium between the emir and the rest of the Taliban's top leadership has developed. And that means ultimately there will be a tug of war that continues between those with more pragmatic views and either the emir personally or Haroun and I believe more importantly the camp and the constituencies that the emir represents of I hesitate to use the word hard line, but of ideological thinking within the movement and across the country, especially concentrated in certain parts of the country. I'm going to hand it over here to Haroun, who will speak a bit more about sources of legitimacy within the Taliban, and I think he'll also take up some of the details that I've alluded to. Haroun, over to you.
Of course, thank you so much, Andrew, for setting up the conversation so wonderfully. And I think one thing what we should keep in mind with regard to the transition that happened when the Taliban as an insurgency took over the reins of the state was this need to formulate policies, and then that meant that some level of autonomous, kind of pluralistic, decentralized for kind of modus operandi from the era of insurgency could not survive. So part of the reasons that the emir, and it was this conversation around how the decision making structure should change from the way it was during the insurgency now that the group was in power, was just the demands of running a state. They had to clarify things, be a little bit more consistent. They had to make decisions that in the past they could defer to local actors or handle in a more decentralized manner. And faced with that, the group underwent, I think, set of dynamics that I think Andrew and I may agree that the results of which were not foregone conclusions. There were real tensions over how this could play out. But in that process, I think the emir and those around him were able to, after everything is said and done, and they went through different phases of different stages of figuring out what are the new rules for decision making in the movement, what are the new kind of rules of operation that are emerging. Through that process, emir came and in his camp became much more assertive. So some of those disputes kind of were resolved in his favor, in favor of his expanded authority to settle matters of internal differences in the movement. But also, I think what we also try to point out in the piece is that once a matter is resolved, even if it's resolved against a certain camp in the movement, actions are taken to make sure that the dissenters are kept in the movement. So they're often the decision to go with a policy option that has some opponents in the movement was followed up with some forms of accommodations given to the dissenters. For example, even though maybe there are some in the movements who thought they would have more control over their portfolios, whether it's security, education, and the emir increasingly asserted influence in those areas, sometimes even overruling them on some issues. Some of those people still keep their jobs. For example, Sirajuddin Haqqani, who's reported to have difference of opinion with the emir on so many issues, still is the Minister of Interior and oversees the security apparatus, a large security apparatus. The same with Minister of Defense, the same acting Minister of Defense, the same with the deputy prime ministers, who have, many of them have even publicly have expressed views that can be interpreted as being critical of the emir's position. That is to say that this under new kind of rules for decision making, the emir does take a very assertive role, but it's still there are actions taken to make sure that the cohesion of the movement is maintained, and those who are decided against, those whose views do not win, are not completely alienated. Even for example, when someone is removed of their position, for example, some governors in northern parts of the countries were removed from their positions because the emir decided that they should not be based in areas where they had popular base of support. They were given other positions. They often were given audiences with the emir. So it is a delicate balance, as Andrew said. On one hand, the emir and his camp, the people around him, would like to have much more control over the entire apparatus, but there's still the tradition of the movement as being a consultative kind of a body where decisions are made with everybody's input, and that being credited as a cause for the remarkable success of the movement to remain unified over very dark and difficult periods of insurgency and now in power is still there. So I think we want to kind of balance that view of the increasingly assertive emir with the view that emir is also interested in keeping everyone in the camp and does sometimes offer certain does outreach to different groups as a way, different factions, and does at least give some differences to the different factions, even if he does not take their views. And that is part of the reasons why I think the group has maintained cohesion and may continue to do so for at least for medium term. In terms of source of legitimacy and what kind of guides the decisions of the emir in terms of the policies he pursues, I think there is one thing that is maybe not as highlighted as much, and that's the precedence of the Mullah Omar, the group's movement, and this idea that the group has to remain true to its origin. Some of the policies that maybe some people hoped there would be a change in the policies that Taliban took on some different issues. Those hopeful people kind of might have gotten disappointed because because of what they perceive to be a failure of the movement to adjust, to reform, to update its views as a way to get more acceptance by the general public in Afghanistan, but also international community. But for those who made decisions not to update the policy, the movement's views on some issues, including education and gender, in their view, the decision was made to remain true to the movement's origin, and it's what they consider to be source of its strength, and that often is seen as their uncompromising commitment to a certain reading of, certain understanding of Sharia. You can consider this to be an ideologically driven, hardened position. You can also look at it from a strategic point of view, that if the movement started changing, then what is it anymore? Like, it would face some identity crisis, and it may lose some core supporters if the movement is seen to be adapting or responding to external pressures, or even is seen to be expanding its base to bring non-Talibans in and accommodate their views. It may lose that ideological core that has kind of preserved its preserved its integrity thus far, and that gives a lot of legitimacy to decisions that are made that often are controversial, even among some within the movement, but are seen as to reflect a continuation with the first time the Taliban ruled the country and the views of the founders of the movement, many of them who are still around and hold positions of power. So it's not just they're remembering things. There are certain figures that represent this continuity, and they want to see that continuity enacted now that they are in the position of power again. And the other issue, and I think Andrew pointed out that as well, it has to do with the fact that how the Emir has always claimed authority as Amir al-Mu'minin, or the commander of faithful, and has promoted this understanding and that everyone in the movement owes a duty of obedience to the Emir. And that duty of obedience sometimes should trump, even in the ideological religious sense, over their personal views and their disagreements, even if those disagreements are rooted in some alternative interpretation of Islam. So some of the issues are open to debate, and if the Emir comes down on one position or another on that debate, that closes the debate. That is and there's a duty owed to the Emir at that point forward to not even question that judgment and take his resolution of that open question as final and binding on everyone. That is something that they advance as ideological ground for closing down the open debate in the movement when it comes, at least public debate in the movement when it comes to controversial issues. Understanding that if these debates become public and ideological and religious points of differences are debated publicly, that would undermine the claim of the Emir to legitimacy based on enforcement of Sharia. So the example of the past, the continuity argument, and as well as this idea of legitimacy of the authority of the Emir to be the final arbiter on matters of differences from a religious perspective, and then his decisions closing down open debates about those issues, are also advanced as a way to strengthen the position of the Emir, and how his decisions are to be obeyed even at times when they conflict with the views of certain members in the movement. Obviously, it leaves very limited space for public debates around issues. Even within the movements, maybe not so public debates are also discouraged, and are seen as a sign of disloyalty, and also as a sign of breaching the duty owed religiously by virtue of one's allegiance to the Emir. That's another factor to keep in mind. And lastly, and I think since I want us to have more time for discussions, I highlight this issue that the international pressure and relation with international pressure is also key here. If the Emir is seen, or the movement is seen, to be responsive to international pressure, it could gain them international acceptance and legitimacy, and could maybe lessen the pressure and would have positive economic outcomes, or maybe make it easier for the Taliban to make advances in terms of their receiving international recognition. But it would seriously possibly undermine their legitimacy in the eyes of their supporters. And I think that explains the kind of mixed messaging that sometimes comes from the statements made by the Emir, where on one hand he says, well, we are going to be uncompromising, we're going to rule out all the harsh punishments that we believe in, we are required to do as a matter of Sharia law. But at the same time, we want to have a good relationship with all the countries, and we want to have a relationship with other countries in the world based on mutual respect. The way that those two are squared in this camp, at least, in the camp that the Emir is part of, is that the international engagement is a separate matter than domestic policies. And if the international engagement is conditioned on changing domestic policies, we'll resist. But if they are decoupled, we are willing to engage with other countries on matters of international cooperation, as long as we are given the autonomy and freedom to implement domestic policies as we see them fit. Obviously, this kind of sidesteps the major issue that at least the major camps in the international community would not move on the issues of recognition and acceptance of the Taliban unless they change their domestic policies. But at least this camp squares its open position, positive position towards international engagements with all the discriminatory and restrictive domestic policies they implement, by saying that these two should be kept separate and they should not be conflated. And sometimes in their speeches, and Emir, for example, admits maybe or hints that he also knows that maybe the international community would not move on its demands that the Taliban change their domestic policies. If that remains the case, he's committed, he's said it publicly, not to not subordinate the domestic policy, the pursuance of domestic policies to the demands of international community. And having said that on the record and having rooted that in his ideas of what Sharia law demands from an Islamic state, it makes it very difficult that there would be some movement on this front in medium term. So that kind of feeds to the stability that Andrew was talking about in the current stalemate that seems to be emerging when it comes to Taliban's gaining more acceptance. But the other parts of the equation that have to do with counterterrorism cooperation, there's a lot more room for cooperation. And I think Taliban even the Emir admits that because it has ramifications for security of other countries, and Taliban have made the commitment that they would not allow Afghanistan territory to be used against other states, there is a legitimate interest by outsider in this particular issue, and the Taliban are ready to cooperate or talk or engage when it comes to those concerns. But when it comes to gender policies, social policies, I think it's seen as an area that the international interest engagement are deemed as unacceptable and inappropriate, and any concessions made on those fronts are seen as compromises, which would be which would run contrary to the group's kind of founding principles that at least the Emir's camp are trying to preserve in their current administration, the current reign. And it would basically lead to them losing support among their core members who have subscribed to the movement, assuming that there is some subscribe to the movements and sacrifice for the movements based on the idea that there will be some stable core ideological principle that would remain that the group remains uncompromising towards, unlike other groups in the Afghan history that have compromised on those principles and were shown, that are often pointed out for condemnation by the Taliban, and their flexibility on those fronts are often seen as their cause for their decline. So I'll stop here, and like Andrew, I think if we hope to discuss some of the more on counterterrorism through question and answer, and we try to kind of lay out the internal dynamics of the movement more in our conversations, leaving the issues of counterterrorism more for question and answers. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Excellent, Andrew and Haroun. And again, I apologize for the technical difficulties, totally out of my control. Please, everybody, put your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom, and we'll get to them shortly. I have one for you. You mentioned the TTP, but I didn't hear you mention ISIS-K. And they seem to be even more of a dramatic shift to the more dogmatic side of things, and seem to be in a period of strength. Could you comment on where you see this going with ISIS-K?
Haroun, do you mind if I jump in at least at first? Thanks very much, Ambassador. It's an important question, and obviously with the Moscow attack just the other week, that's on the minds of everyone around the world, maybe more than any time since the American and international evacuation from Kabul. The last time an ISKP attack attracted this much global attention was their devastating bombing of the Kabul airport as the Americans and other internationals were trying to complete the evacuation in August 2021. Of course, ISKP has been active in the country since then. There's some incredibly heated debate among those who study ISKP from more of a global counterterrorism lens versus those who look at militancy very tightly rooted in the region. And the reason for that is because I think a couple things have shaped ISKP's evolution and development since the Taliban's takeover. One, just as a baseline, even though the Taliban are also an organization that draws its legacy from in part, in addition to the many organic Afghan elements of their movement, global jihadism, violent extremist global jihadism. And that wound up being more true throughout the course of their insurgency over the course of 20 years, because the pariah status and the being driven to underground and outcast from the rest of Afghan society in hiding in Pakistan and at times in remote areas of Afghanistan. So there are undeniably similar veins from which the Taliban, their allies that consist of global jihadist networks draw from, and what ISKP draws from. But it's important to note that since ISKP's inception and as the first recognized branch of the Islamic State around the world, they have been a sworn enemy of the Taliban. It is a challenge from the Taliban's extreme ideological flank. ISKP from day one has derided the Taliban just as much as they have Western intervention forces present in Afghanistan or the Afghan government supported by those forces. The Taliban have been derided just like everyone else as not being sufficiently pure in their jihadist aims. And that is a campaign, and that is not just an ideological tenet, but that is an organizing force that the Islamic State has really anchored itself around in the region since the Taliban's takeover. What we saw happen, sorry, I could this entire discussion could be just about ISKP instead. The Islamic State in Afghanistan after the Taliban's takeover sought to test the proposition as to whether or not the Taliban were fragile enough that they could be destabilized and that they could be shaken from having just overtaken the country. What ISKP did in the last half of 2021 and throughout the first half of 2022 was to mount as many attacks as they possibly could. What they were doing resembled insurgent asymmetric violence. They were striking 9 times out of 10 or more Taliban security forces. They were going after checkpoints. They were going after ministry buildings. They were, when they could, attempting to assassinate higher value Taliban leadership targets. Towards the end of 2022, and this has been charted and studied, and you can now see graphs of it, the peak of ISKP activity at the end of 2021 is now graphed and charted as declining first steadily and now has almost been eliminated in terms of activity inside the state of Afghanistan itself. This is not entirely where things get tricky, and where the debate starts is how much the Taliban's counterterrorism campaign against ISKP is actually to be credited for that drop in activity, and whether how much of it is a corresponding shift in strategic intent from ISKP, which we certainly saw. At the same time that ISK's operational tempo began dropping so dramatically towards the end of 2022, we saw their focus on strategic targets. And when I say strategic, targets that were selected with the intent of grabbing not only global headlines, but of disrupting regional and even wider political dynamics. So at the end of 2022, no longer were Taliban security forces being targeted, but once every several months, you had a spectacular attack against one of the embassies that was based in Kabul, regional states that remained with a diplomatic presence in the country under the Taliban, Russia, Pakistan, not the Chinese embassy, but a hotel that hosted Chinese businessmen, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when they were hosting a delegation of Chinese diplomatic representatives. And this went on and on. The ISKP's campaign grew more strategic. And the real question is whether or not that's because the Taliban was depleting their capacity and degrading their ability to act as an insurgent movement against them, or whether ISKP realized that its capacity was being weakened and intentionally pivoted to a more pure, I think, what we would consider campaign of terroristic violence. What we saw throughout 2023, exemplified both in the Moscow bombings and in Kerman, Iran, in the first days of this year, where ISKP's attempt to really internationalize its campaign of terroristic violence. Again, that's not to say that the Taliban successfully drove ISKP out of Afghanistan, but the pressure that they put on this group rendered Afghanistan to be a less than permissive environment. I think one of the most telling things that has not been widely publicized, but did come out of off-the-record U.S. Intelligence community sources in media late last year, was an admission from these U.S. government sources that many ISKP leadership figures have fled the country. They're not even based in Afghanistan anymore. And according to those US sources, that's because the Taliban have driven them out. So we have this really odd dynamic where globally ISKP may be a greater threat than ever before, but that's due to its adaptability, its resilience, and its internationalization. But that's also, I really hesitate, and I'll hand it back over because I'm parsing words here, but we also don't want to give the Taliban too much credit because there are real flaws, and I say their counterterrorism strategy against ISKP in quotes because it doesn't resemble anything that the rest of the world understands as counterterrorism. For the Taliban, this is rooting out a potential rival and threat to their authority, and nothing more. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Just to remind everybody, if you've got a question, please put it in the Q&A function. Haroun, would you like to add anything to that? I mean, we did get a question which pivoted on mine, talking about, if we could talk in more detail about the Taliban policy towards what we just discussed, ISIS-K, TPP, and Al-Qaeda, and how they differ.
With regard to ISKP, which is I think it's different than the two other entities because of the fact that it has all along had a hostile relationship with the Taliban. I just add that the Taliban really took the threat of ISKP very seriously, and I've done some work on the madrasas and the religious education space in Afghanistan, and there were fundamental decisions made to increase control over religious education in the country, increase monitoring, increase policing of these spaces, explicitly so what they consider subversive ideologies, subversive groups would not find a footing in those spaces. So the counterterrorism of the Taliban, however it may be perceived from the outside world, was comprehensive from their own point of view. How successful it has been, I think, as Andrew said, it's hard to find a correct measure. If the measure is the number of attacks in the country, it has declined. If the measure is the displacement to other parts of the country, maybe you would get a different story. And if the measure is how consistent it was with the treatment of the population, because Taliban actually used a lot of brute force in addition to maybe more subtle forms of engagement with religious educations and religious spaces as a way to make sure that the ISKP does not find a footing in the country. Those are different questions to be answered. With regard to Al-Qaeda and TTP, I think they have to be looked at it separately. Al-Qaeda and just the question of foreign fighters in the country, Taliban have always maintained that the mere presence of foreign fighters in the country is not a violation of their international obligations. As long as those foreign fighters are not actively engaging in attacks against other countries, the mere presence was not something they have committed to do something about, basically. They're saying the fact that there are people with Al-Qaeda affiliation in the country or other different groups in the country in itself is not something they have promised anybody they will do something about, as long as those individuals do not engage in activities that actively harm other countries. And how they make sure that remains the case is something that they have systems to deal with. Often GDI and others require these groups to register with the Taliban and report other activities, so they have active surveillance on them. And there's also the question of some within the Taliban movement are sympathetic towards some of the transnational goals of these movements. And even if the top leadership of the Taliban would like this surveillance to be a way to keep an eye on them so they don't cause troubles in the region, some within the movement may actually be sympathetic to those goals. And in actual implementation of that policy, there could be flaws and there could be some within the movement that actively support their transnational goals. So I want to distinguish between what the Taliban at the top leadership may formulate as a policy, and then the body of the movement or some voices in the movement could actually have opposing objectives and could be helping some of these individuals in their transnational objectives. But the Taliban movement have basically said that the mere presence in the country is not a violation. We'll keep an eye on them. We control them. We try to control them so they would not cause threats to other countries. And in doing so, they require these groups to register their movements, their presence with the GDI. And that mostly applies to foreign fighters, not necessarily the TTP. TTP, just the sheer number of TTP fighters who are in part of the country, disputed territories, given that the Iran line is not formally recognized. The sheer numbers, the deep ties they have, this fluidity of identity of who's Pakistani, who's Afghan, all of those play in. And the ties with the movement go much deeper, given that it involves past fighting bonds that were forged during the shared fighting, but also given that there are family ties, there are common tribes occupying both parts of the border. With regard to those, I think Taliban have they wish that problem to be solved in a way that does not put them in a conflicting position with in a direct path of confrontation with the Pakistan, but they're not willing to do enough. It seems like that would satisfy the Pakistani state as well. They've offered some compromises. For example, the Minister of Interior of the Taliban issued reports of how many arrests they made of TTP, ostensibly for violations of the rules that the Taliban put in place for all foreign fighters who are active in the country. Again, reportings and activities they do, and all of that in violation of those. And then there was a brief conversation about maybe moving the TTP families from the border areas to some other part of the country, which has its own issues with regard to host communities and their willingness of these families to actually move, given that they have deep ties in these areas. But none of that has been enough. And I think Taliban have defaulted to saying that the Pakistani government should seek out negotiation with the TTP as a way of getting Taliban out of this bind they are in, that their commitments to their wartime ally in TTP and their desire to have at least a working relationship with Pakistan that is not outright hostile. And I think it also connects to what Andrew was saying. The Taliban do appreciate that may not actually work out, and the Pakistan may remain a hostile neighbor to them, or becomes a hostile neighbor to them, and that would necessitate them having relationship with other countries in the neighbor, but also beyond neighbors, since their other neighbors are also have a reputation, have a history of having aspirations towards Afghanistan that conflict with what Taliban's desire for self-autonomy and self-regulation. So US becomes an important actor, China becomes an important actor, if you put it in that context of the Taliban wanting to have a counterweight to kind of give themselves a little bit of room for maneuver against neighbors, since Afghanistan is a landlocked countries, who could basically control access to the country, both in terms of resources, but also they have the capacity to possibly support. No one has made the decision, but they could possibly support the armed resistance to the country as well, to the Taliban rule as well. Andrew?
Excellent, guys.
Fantastic.
We have quietly run out of time. I have one more question that I'm going to send to you, and hopefully you can answer it directly with the the individual in question. Before I lose my total connection here, I'd just like to thank you, Haroun and Andrew, for a very lively and interesting presentation. I'm sure that we will be discussing Afghanistan and the Taliban and the future of Afghanistan in the not too distant future. So stay connected, stay in tune, and again, thank you very much for those who are listening. And of course, thank you very much to our speakers. It was a great presentation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, John. Bye-bye.